There was a time when being yourself felt simple. Not easy. It was never easy to be fully honest, fully vulnerable, fully unguarded. But it was simple. The calculation was straightforward. You had to decide whether you trusted someone enough to show them who you really were, whether the relationship was deep enough to risk being seen, whether the space felt safe enough to let your guard down. Those were the only variables: trust, depth, safety. And once you determined those conditions were met, you could just be. You could say what you actually thought, share what you genuinely felt, show up without editing yourself for palatability. That simplicity is gone. Being yourself now involves a completely different set of calculations. It's not just about trust anymore. It's about permanence, about context collapse, about the possibility that anything you say or do will be recorded, screenshotted, shared with people who don't know you, interpreted by strangers who have no investment in understanding your full humanity. It's about navigating an environment where authenticity has real, tangible costs, where being misunderstood isn't just emotionally uncomfortable, it can affect your reputation, your relationships, your livelihood, your future. Where one unguarded moment, one unfiltered opinion, one instance of being fully yourself without calculating how it will be received can become the thing that defines you permanently. So you don't take that risk. You perform instead. You curate. You show a version of yourself that's been run through multiple filters: safety filters, palatability filters. Will this be misunderstood filters? Could this be used against me later filters? And that performance, which starts as a protective measure, becomes so habitual that you lose track of where it ends and you begin. The performed self and the real self blur together until you're not even sure anymore what being yourself would actually look like, what thoughts are genuinely yours versus which ones you've adopted because they're safer to have, what feelings are authentic versus which ones you've learned to perform because they're more socially acceptable. What version of you is real versus which one is the carefully maintained facade you've built to navigate a world that punishes authenticity. This didn't happen because you became fake or lost your integrity. It happened because the environment changed in ways that made authenticity genuinely risky. The conditions that used to support being yourself, private spaces where nothing was recorded, relationships that existed outside public view, conversations that faded from memory instead of living forever in searchable archives, social contexts where mistakes were forgiven and growth was expected. Those conditions have been systematically eliminated, and in their place, we have digital permanence, context collapse, algorithmic amplification of controversy, and a culture that treats every misstep as definitive evidence of who you are. Navigating that environment while trying to maintain any semblance of authenticity is like trying to have a genuine conversation while knowing everything you say is being recorded for potential use in a future trial. The knowledge of surveillance changes what you're willing to say, changes what you're willing to reveal, changes who you're willing to be. Think about what authenticity actually requires. It requires the freedom to be wrong, to say things you don't fully believe yet because you're thinking out loud, to express feelings that aren't fully formed, to have rough edges that need smoothing, to be in process, to change your mind, to grow, to look back on past versions of yourself and recognize you've evolved. But modern life doesn't allow for any of that. Every version of you is permanent. Every statement is definitive. Every opinion you express is evidence of who you are, not just who you were in that moment. And that permanence makes growth dangerous because growth requires admitting you were wrong, requires acknowledging that your previous understanding was incomplete, requires showing the awkward in-between stages where you're figuring things out. But when all of that is documented, when past versions of you exist in permanent searchable archives, growth becomes evidence of hypocrisy rather than evolution. You held this opinion 5 years ago, and now you hold a different one. Instead of being seen as growth, as someone who learned and changed, you're seen as inconsistent, as not having strong convictions, as performatively changing positions for social approval. There's no room for evolution when every version of you is preserved and available for comparison. So you learn to hedge, to qualify everything, to add disclaimers, to protect yourself from future accountability for current thoughts that might change. You don't just say what you think, you say, I think this now, but I'm open to being wrong. Or this is my current understanding, but I'm still learning. Or I don't know if this is right, but... Every statement comes with an escape route. Every opinion comes with built-in plausible deniability. Not because you're being dishonest, but because you're trying to preserve the freedom to change without being held forever to positions you no longer hold. And this constant hedging, this perpetual qualification, makes authentic expression almost impossible. Because authentic expression is direct. It's I think this, not I think this, but I could be wrong and I'm still figuring it out, and I don't want to offend anyone and I'm open to other perspectives. That qualification might be honest. You probably are open to being wrong. You probably are still figuring it out, but it's also defensive. It's not how you'd speak if you felt genuinely safe. If you believed you could say something, be wrong, learn, change your mind, and that be okay. If you trusted that growth would be recognized as growth rather than condemned as inconsistency. But you don't have that trust anymore. You can't have it because the environment doesn't support it. When past positions are used as weapons against present evolution, when changing your mind is treated as evidence of moral failing rather than intellectual honesty, when growth is punished rather than celebrated, you learn to never commit fully to anything, to always leave room for retreat, to never be so authentic that you can't later claim you didn't really mean it that way. The collapse of private space has made this infinitely worse. There used to be places where you could be unfiltered, where you could say things you were working through without them being taken as definitive statements, where you could test ideas, express half-formed thoughts, be messy and contradictory and human without it being documented. Private conversations, personal journals, close friendships, spaces that existed off the record, where the stakes of authenticity were lower because there was no permanent record, no public audience, no possibility of viral misinterpretation. Those spaces barely exist anymore. Private conversations get screenshotted and shared. Group chats leak. Messages get forwarded. Even journals, if they're digital, aren't truly private. They can be hacked, leaked, subpoenaed. And relationships themselves can turn. Someone who was a trusted friend can become an enemy. And suddenly, all those private, authentic moments you shared are potential ammunition. Every vulnerability you revealed in confidence becomes something they could use against you. Every vulnerability becomes a weapon in their arsenal. So you learn to perform, even in private, even with people you think you trust, because you don't know who will eventually see it, don't know how relationships will change, don't know what might later be used as evidence of who you are. You're always performing for an audience you can't see, an audience that doesn't know your context, doesn't care about your growth, doesn't have any investment in understanding the full complexity of who you are. Social media amplified all of this beyond recognition. Every platform is built on performance. You're not sharing your life, you're creating a narrative. You're building a brand. Even when you're trying to be authentic, even when you're sharing vulnerability, you're doing it publicly. And public vulnerability is fundamentally different from private vulnerability. Private vulnerability is risky because the other person might reject you, might not understand, might not care. But public vulnerability is risky in an entirely different way, because it's not just about whether the audience receives it well, it's about whether it can be weaponized, whether it can be taken out of context, whether it can be used to define you in ways you never intended. And this creates a strange paradox. Authenticity is valued online. It's rewarded with engagement. People respond to vulnerability, to honesty, to the appearance of realness. So you perform authenticity. You share carefully curated vulnerability. You reveal things that seem private, but are actually calculated to land well, to elicit sympathy, to build connection, to demonstrate that you're real, relatable, human. But it's not real vulnerability. Real vulnerability is unplanned, it's messy, it's saying something you're not sure how to articulate, it's sharing things you're not sure you should share, it's being unsure of how it will be received and doing it anyway. Public vulnerability is none of those things. It's strategic, rehearsed, optimized for reception, which makes it performance, not authenticity. And you can tell the difference. Everyone can. But we pretend we can't because the performed version is safer, easier to manage, less likely to go wrong. And over time, we've become so good at performing authenticity that the performance feels real even to us. We believe our own carefully crafted narratives. We think we're being vulnerable when we're actually being strategic. We confuse sharing what we know will be well received with sharing what's true. And in that confusion, we lose touch with what authentic self-expression even feels like. The stakes of being yourself have also changed in ways that make it genuinely dangerous. Cancel culture, call-out dynamics, public shaming, these aren't just theoretical risks, they're real consequences that happen to real people for real expressions of authenticity. You say something poorly phrased, something taken out of context, something that was acceptable yesterday but isn't today, and suddenly you're not just wrong, you're a bad person, you're morally suspect, you deserve punishment. And that punishment isn't proportional. It's not, you made a mistake, here's feedback, please do better. It's, you're terrible, everyone should know you're terrible, and you should suffer consequences that extend far beyond the actual harm of what you said. And those consequences are real. Lost jobs, lost friendships, lost opportunities, harassment, threats, public humiliation. For saying something, for being yourself in a moment when being yourself happened to violate some invisible line you didn't know existed. And watching that happen to others teaches you a lesson. It teaches you that authenticity is dangerous, that being unfiltered is risky, that the cost of saying the wrong thing, of expressing the wrong opinion, of being yourself in the wrong way at the wrong time is potentially catastrophic. So you don't do it. You perform safety instead. But here's the thing. The performance doesn't actually keep you safe. Because the standards keep changing. What's acceptable keeps shifting. The things you're supposed to know, supposed to care about, supposed to have opinions on, they multiply faster than anyone can keep track of. You're expected to have the right take on everything, to be informed about every issue, to express the correct level of concern about every problem. And if you don't, if you're silent when you're supposed to speak, or if you speak when you're supposed to listen, or if you say the wrong thing even with good intentions, you're still at risk, still vulnerable to call out, still subject to punishment. So the performance becomes exhausting. You're not just managing what you say, you're managing your silence as carefully as your speech. You're monitoring trending topics to know what you're supposed to have opinions about. You're reading the room constantly to know what positions are safe to hold. You're performing awareness, performing care, performing the right level of engagement with issues you may not actually understand. And all of that performance, all of that vigilance is work, emotional work, cognitive work. Work that never ends because the standards never stabilize and the audience never stops watching. Context collapse has made this even harder. In the past, you could be different versions of yourself in different contexts: professional at work, casual with friends, silly with family, political in some spaces, apolitical in others. You could modulate who you were based on who you were with, and that wasn't fake, that was normal. We all contain multitudes. We all show different aspects of ourselves in different contexts. That's not inauthenticity, that's appropriate social adaptation. But online, all those contexts collapse into one. Your coworkers see what you share with friends. Your family sees what you share with professional connections. People who know you in one context see you in all contexts. And you can't be all versions of yourself simultaneously. So you become the most neutral version, the most broadly acceptable version, the version that won't offend your grandmother or alienate your colleagues or confuse your friends. You perform a composite self that's bland enough to work in all contexts, which means it's not really authentic to any of them. And this flattening, this compression of your full self into a single performative persona is exhausting because you can't relax into any particular mode of being. You're always managing for the broadest possible audience, always thinking about who might see this, always aware that being authentic to one context might mean being inappropriate to another. So you just bland out. You show the parts of yourself that are safe for everyone, and you hide everything else, all the complexity, all the contradictions, all the aspects of yourself that don't fit the simplified narrative you're presenting. There's also the weaponization of language itself. Words change meaning. Phrases that were neutral become loaded. Concepts that were uncontroversial become political. And you can't keep up with all of it, can't track every shift in linguistic usage, can't know in advance which words will be acceptable and which will mark you as ignorant, insensitive, or worse. So you learn to speak carefully, to use language that's been vetted, to avoid anything that might be misinterpreted, to say less rather than risk saying the wrong thing in the wrong way. But careful language isn't authentic language. Authentic language is how you actually think, how ideas form in your mind before you've translated them into approved terminology. It's rough, imprecise, sometimes using words in ways that aren't technically correct, but capture something you're trying to express. It's language in service of truth, not performance. But you can't speak that way anymore, because imprecise language gets interpreted as something other than what you meant, gets held against you as evidence of bad faith or ignorance or malice. So you translate everything before you say it, run it through the approved vocabulary, make sure it can't be misinterpreted. And in that translation, the authentic thought gets lost. What comes out is a sanitized version, correct, inoffensive, empty. And this linguistic policing extends beyond just word choice. It affects sentence structure, tone, the entire way you communicate. You can't be direct anymore, because directness can be read as aggression. You have to soften everything with qualifiers and hedges and apologies. I think becomes, I feel like maybe. No becomes, I'm not sure that works for me right now. Simple statements become paragraphs of qualification. And that constant softening, that perpetual cushioning of every statement to prevent it from landing too hard, makes genuine communication nearly impossible. Because sometimes things need to be said directly. Sometimes you need to state a boundary clearly. Sometimes you need to express disagreement without hedging it into meaninglessness. Sometimes authentic communication is uncomfortable, is direct, is unadorned by the linguistic padding that makes everything safe for consumption. But you can't communicate that way anymore without risking being labeled aggressive, insensitive, problematic. So you pad everything, soften everything, qualify everything until the original point is so buried under layers of linguistic protection that it barely exists anymore. And this creates a kind of communication that looks like conversation, but isn't. Everyone is speaking carefully. Everyone is managing their language. Everyone is performing thoughtful communication while actually saying nothing of substance. You have entire exchanges where nothing real is communicated, where everyone leaves feeling like they talked, but no one feels heard, where words were exchanged, but no genuine understanding was reached. Because the goal wasn't communication. The goal was avoiding miscommunication, avoiding offense, avoiding any statement that could be screenshotted and used to paint you as problematic. There's also the problem of performative allyship and moral performance. You're expected to have the right positions on everything, to signal your values constantly, to perform your moral goodness for public validation. And this creates pressure to not just have opinions, but to display those opinions, to make sure everyone knows you're on the right side, to use your platform, however small, to demonstrate your commitment to causes, to speak out when you're supposed to speak out, to amplify when you're supposed to amplify, to show up when you're supposed to show up. But all of this performance, all of this public moral signaling, often has nothing to do with authentic values or genuine care. It's about managing your image, about avoiding being seen as complicit through silence, about protecting yourself from accusations of not caring enough. So you perform caring. You post the right things. You share the right content. You say the right words. And maybe you do care. Maybe your values are genuine, but the performance of them, the public display of them, the constant need to demonstrate them, that's not about the values themselves. That's about managing how you're perceived. That's about staying safe by showing you're on the right side. And this creates a strange situation where you can care deeply about something, but be unable to express that care authentically, because the required performance of caring is so specific and so rigid that genuine expression gets classified as insufficient. You have to say exactly the right things in exactly the right way, with exactly the right hashtags and exactly the right acknowledgments and exactly the right disclaimers, or your care doesn't count. Worse, it might count against you, might be evidence that you don't actually care enough, or don't understand the issue deeply enough, or are performing allyship rather than being genuine. But the reality is, everyone is performing. The people criticizing insufficient performance are themselves performing a more thorough version of the same performance. And underneath all of it, underneath all the performative moral positioning, it's hard to know what anyone actually thinks or feels or values, because the performance has become so standardized, so ritualized, that it's impossible to distinguish genuine conviction from strategic positioning. Everyone is saying the same things in the same ways for the same reasons, to be seen as good, to avoid being seen as bad, to maintain social acceptance in contexts where moral performance is required. And this makes authentic moral engagement nearly impossible, because authentic moral engagement is messy, it's questioning, it's uncertainty, it's working through complex issues without clear answers, it's admitting when you don't know, it's changing your position as you learn, it's expressing care in ways that might not match the approved template. But none of that is safe anymore. Questioning gets read as doubt. Uncertainty gets read as insufficient commitment. Changing positions gets read as moral inconsistency. Expressing care in unapproved ways gets read as not really caring. So you perform the approved version. You say the right things, you demonstrate the right level of concern, you signal the right values. And your actual moral thinking, your genuine questions, your real process of working through complex issues, all of that happens in private, if it happens at all, Because after enough performance, after enough suppression of genuine thought in favor of approved positioning, you start to lose track of what you actually think versus what you're supposed to think. The performance becomes the reality, and your authentic moral center, your genuine capacity for ethical reasoning, atrophies from lack of use. This is particularly damaging because moral reasoning requires practice, requires wrestling with complexity, requires being wrong and learning from it, requires dialogue and debate and the clash of different perspectives. But all of that requires safety to be wrong, safety to question, safety to work through difficult issues publicly without being condemned for the messiness of that process. And that safety doesn't exist anymore. So moral reasoning becomes privatized for those who can maintain it, or disappears entirely for those who can't, replaced by simple adherence to whatever positions are currently approved. The economic entanglement makes all of this worse. Your online presence isn't just social anymore. It's professional. It's how clients find you, how employers evaluate you, how opportunities come to you, which means every aspect of your online performance has professional implications. You can't just be yourself online, because being yourself might cost you professionally, might close doors, might limit opportunities. So you perform professionalism, perform palatability, perform the version of yourself that keeps career options open. But this professional performance bleeds into everything else. You can't have a professional online presence and a separate, authentic personal one, because they're not really separate. Potential employers look at everything. Clients see everything. Professional contacts follow your personal accounts. So your personal expression has to be managed for professional acceptability. Your hobbies have to be appropriate. Your politics have to be moderate or hidden. Your sense of humor has to be safe. Your friendships have to be with the right kind of people. Everything becomes managed for professional optics. And this creates a life where you're never off stage, never able to just be a person with thoughts and feelings and interests that exist outside professional contexts. Everything is potentially relevant to your professional brand. Everything could affect how you're perceived in professional spaces. So everything gets managed. Everything gets curated. Everything becomes part of the professional performance you maintain to keep your economic life viable. This is particularly crushing for people in industries where personal brand matters, where your online presence is part of your professional value, where you're expected to have a platform, to share insights, to be visible and engaged and constantly producing content that demonstrates your expertise or creativity or whatever it is you're selling. For these people, there's no separation at all between personal and professional. Everything is brand. Everything is performance. Everything is optimized for professional outcomes. And even for people not in those industries, even for people whose work doesn't require platform or visibility, the pressure exists because future opportunities might require it, because pivoting careers might mean building a platform, because who knows what professional requirements will be in 5 years. So you maintain the performance just in case, just to keep options open, just to avoid foreclosing possibilities you might want later. And in doing so, you foreclose the possibility of authentic existence now. The intergenerational dimension of this is also worth considering. Younger people, people who've grown up with social media, often don't remember a time when being yourself didn't require this level of performance. They've never known anything different. For them, curating identity, performing for audiences, managing their image, this is just what existing in the world means. They don't have the reference point of simpler authenticity that older people remember, don't have the contrast that makes the current situation feel like loss. But that doesn't mean they're not suffering from it. In many ways, they suffer more because they don't even know what they're missing, don't know that authentic expression used to be simpler, don't know that relationships used to be able to form outside of performative contexts. don't know that you used to be able to make mistakes without them being permanent. They think the constant performance, the perpetual surveillance, the endless management of image, they think that's just how life is, how it has to be, how it's always been. And that belief makes it even harder for them to resist, because resistance requires believing something different is possible, requires having experienced or at least heard about conditions where authenticity was safer, where mistakes were forgiven, where growth was expected, where you could be yourself without it being weaponized. Without that reference point, without that knowledge that things could be different, why would you resist? Why would you push back against conditions you think are natural and inevitable? This generational difference creates interesting dynamics in families and workplaces. Older people lamenting the loss of authenticity, younger people genuinely confused about what they're talking about. What do you mean you used to just say what you thought? Didn't you worry about how it would be received? Didn't you think about who might be listening? Didn't you consider whether it might be taken the wrong way? These questions aren't rhetorical. They're genuine confusion, because for younger people, those considerations are so automatic, so fundamental to communication, that the idea of not doing them is incomprehensible. And teaching younger people about simpler authenticity is difficult because you can describe it, can tell stories about it, but they can't really experience it in their current context, can't practice it in conditions that might support it. The conditions don't exist anymore. So even if they understand intellectually that things used to be different, they can't access that difference experientially, can't learn what authentic expression feels like when authentic expression in their actual environment is genuinely unsafe. This creates a strange situation where resistance to performative culture is mostly coming from people who remember something different, who have that contrast, who experienced simpler authenticity and know what's been lost. But those people are aging out, are becoming less relevant, are being replaced by people who've never known anything different, which means the performative culture is becoming more entrenched, more accepted, more treated as natural rather than constructed, and resistance to it is becoming more marginalized, more seen as nostalgia for a past that wasn't actually better, more dismissed as older people not understanding how the world works now. But the cost of performative existence doesn't change just because people have gotten used to it. The psychological damage is the same, whether you remember something different or not. The isolation of never being truly known is the same. The exhaustion of constant image management is the same. The loss of connection to authentic self is the same. Younger people might not frame it the same way, might not talk about it as loss of authenticity, might describe it as anxiety, depression, loneliness, meaninglessness. But the underlying cause is often the same: living in conditions that prevent genuine self-expression, that require constant performance, that make being yourself risky in ways that accumulate into unbearable psychic cost. So when we talk about creating spaces for authentic expression, we're not just talking about returning to some idealized past. We're talking about creating conditions that have never existed for many people, conditions they've heard about maybe, but never experienced. And creating those conditions requires deliberately constructing what used to emerge more naturally, requires being intentional about privacy, about safety, about creating context where performance isn't required, requires teaching people what authentic expression even is when they've spent their entire lives performing. This is hard work, much harder than it used to be. When conditions naturally supported authenticity, you didn't have to think about it much. You just were yourself in contexts where being yourself was normal. But now, creating those contexts requires deliberate effort, requires going against the grain of how everything is structured, requires building alternatives to systems designed to prevent what you're trying to create. And the work starts with recognizing the specific mechanisms that prevent authenticity: digital permanence, context collapse, moral performance requirements, professional entanglement, linguistic policing, call-out culture. These aren't vague forces, they're specific mechanisms with specific effects, and each one requires specific responses. Digital permanence requires creating offline spaces. Context collapse requires maintaining separate context deliberately. Moral performance requirements require finding people who value genuine engagement over approved positioning. Professional entanglement requires separating personal life from professional brand where possible. Linguistic policing requires finding spaces where imprecise language in service of truth is valued over precise language in service of safety. Call-out culture requires building relationships with people committed to repair over punishment. None of this is easy. All of it requires time, effort, and intention. Requires saying no to platforms and practices that prevent authenticity. Requires investing in relationships that support it. Requires protecting spaces and practices that create it. Requires accepting that this means less visibility, less platform, less apparent success by metrics that reward performance. Requires being willing to seem less engaged, less productive, less present in spaces that require performance for participation. And it requires patience, because if you've been performing for years, if you've suppressed your authentic self for so long, you can't just flip a switch and be genuine again. The patterns are too deep, the habits too ingrained. Even in safe spaces, even with safe people, performance will be your default, will be what comes automatically. Breaking through that requires practice, repeatedly choosing to be authentic even when performance is easier, repeatedly trusting safety even when trust feels dangerous, repeatedly showing yourself even when hiding feels safer. And it requires failure, requires being authentic and having it go badly sometimes, having your honesty misunderstood, having your vulnerability used against you, having your authentic self rejected, not because the space was never safe, but because safety isn't absolute. Because even in generally safe spaces, mistakes happen, misunderstandings occur, repair is needed, and learning to navigate that, learning that authenticity can survive imperfect reception, can survive needing to repair, can survive misunderstanding that gets worked through, that's essential. Because perfect safety doesn't exist. If you're waiting for perfect safety before being authentic, you'll never be authentic. You have to accept imperfect safety, have to practice being yourself in contexts that are safe enough, even if not perfectly safe. And this is terrifying after years of learning that any imperfection in safety means danger, that any potential for misunderstanding means you should protect yourself through performance, that any risk of rejection means stay hidden. Unlearning that requires repeatedly experiencing that imperfect safety is still workable, that repair is possible, that authenticity can survive less than perfect reception, that being yourself, even messily, even imperfectly, even in contexts that aren't guaranteed safe, is better than the alternative of permanent performance. This is the work. Not simple, not quick, not the same as it used to be, requiring more effort, more intention, more protection than authenticity used to need, but possible and necessary, because the alternative, lifetime of performance, complete suppression of authentic self, permanent disconnection from who you actually are, that's not a life, that's survival. And survival isn't the same as living. You can survive in performance mode, many people do, but you can't thrive, can't feel fully alive, can't experience the kind of deep satisfaction and genuine connection that only comes from being truly seen and accepted for who you actually are. And the more you do this, the more you lose touch with how you actually think. Your authentic thoughts start to seem wrong, problematic, dangerous. You begin self-censoring not just your speech, but your thinking, training yourself to think in approved ways, to have acceptable thoughts, to police your own mind for problematic impulses before they can become problematic statements. And that internal censorship, that constant monitoring of your own thoughts for acceptability, is how you lose yourself completely. Because if you can't even think freely, if even your private thoughts have to pass through filters of social acceptability, there's no authentic self left. There's just the performed version. And the performed version has replaced you so thoroughly that you can't remember what you were before you started performing. The economic implications make this worse. Your online presence isn't just social anymore, it's professional. Employers Google you, clients check your social media, opportunities depend on maintaining the right image. And that means even more pressure to curate, more pressure to perform, because being yourself could cost you professionally, could close doors, could limit opportunities. So you perform professionalism, perform palatability, perform the version of yourself that keeps options open, that doesn't alienate potential employers or clients or connections, that presents you as safe, competent, appropriate for professional contexts. But that performance is so far from authentic that it creates a kind of existential split. There's the professional you that exists online, and there's the actual you that exists where exactly? In private moments? In journal entries? In thoughts you don't share? Even there, even in supposedly private spaces, you're still performing, still aware that nothing is truly private, still censoring yourself just in case. So where does the real you exist? Where is there space for genuine authenticity when every space is either public or potentially public, when every moment could be recorded, when every statement could be preserved? The answer, increasingly, is nowhere. The authentic self has no home, no safe space, no context where it can exist without performance. And when authenticity has nowhere to exist, it atrophies. You lose the ability to access it, lose the sense of what it feels like to just be, without calculation, without performance, without managing for an audience. You forget what you actually think because you've spent so long performing what you're supposed to think. You forget what you actually feel because you've spent so long performing acceptable emotions. You forget who you actually are because you've spent so long being who you're supposed to be. And this creates a profound loneliness because you can be surrounded by people, have hundreds of connections online, dozens of relationships offline, and still feel completely unknown because no one knows you. They know your performed version. They know the carefully managed persona you present. They know what you've allowed them to see, but they don't know you, and you know they don't know you. And that knowledge creates a barrier, a sense that even in your closest relationships, even with people you think you trust, you're still performing, still managing, still not fully seen. And being unknown like this, being surrounded by people who think they know you but don't, is worse than being alone. Because at least when you're alone, you can acknowledge that you're isolated. But when you're surrounded by people who think they know you, you can't even admit to yourself how profoundly alone you are, how unknown, how unseen. You have to maintain the fiction that these relationships are real, that this connection is genuine, that you're being authentic when you're actually just performing a version of authenticity that's close enough to fool most people most of the time. The psychological cost of this is immense. Constant self-monitoring is exhausting, always aware of how you're being perceived, always managing your image, always calculating whether this statement is safe, this opinion is acceptable, this feeling is appropriate to share. That vigilance takes energy, mental energy, emotional energy, energy that could go towards actually living, actually connecting, actually experiencing your life. But instead, it goes towards managing your presentation of your life, towards curating your existence, towards performing being you. And over time, that performance becomes so automatic that you stop noticing it. The monitoring becomes unconscious. The calculation becomes reflex. You don't even realize you're doing it anymore. You just automatically filter everything through how will this be received before it comes out. You automatically censor thoughts before they become words. You automatically perform the version of yourself that's safest, most acceptable, least likely to cause problems. And that automation, that unconscious performance, is how you lose yourself completely. Because if the performance is automatic, if it happens before you're even aware you're doing it, how do you access what's underneath? How do you get back to the authentic thought, the real feeling, the genuine self, when all of that has been suppressed so thoroughly that it doesn't even surface anymore? The answer is you can't. Not easily. Not without deliberately interrupting the automatic performance. Not without creating space where authenticity is safer than performance. Not without finding contexts where being yourself carries less risk than hiding yourself. And those contexts are increasingly rare, increasingly difficult to create, increasingly unsupported by the structures of modern life. But they're not impossible. And understanding why being yourself feels risky now, understanding the specific mechanisms that made authenticity dangerous, is the first step toward creating conditions where it becomes safer again. Not safe in the absolute sense. Authenticity always carries risk, but safer than it currently feels, more possible than it currently seems. First, you need to understand that the risk is real. This isn't paranoia. This isn't you being oversensitive or cowardly. The environment has genuinely changed in ways that make authenticity riskier than it used to be. Digital permanence is real. Context collapse is real. Public callouts are real. The consequences of being misunderstood are real. Acknowledging that the risk is real is important because it allows you to stop blaming yourself for being inauthentic. You're not being fake because you lack courage or integrity. You're adapting to an environment that genuinely punishes authenticity. That's a reasonable response to real danger. But reasonable doesn't mean sustainable. You can't spend your entire life performing, can't maintain constant vigilance forever, can't suppress your authentic self indefinitely without significant psychological cost. So while adapting to the environment is reasonable, it's also something that will eventually break you if you don't find ways to interrupt it, ways to create space for authenticity, even in an environment designed to punish it. That space has to start in private, real private, not digital private where everything can be screenshotted or leaked, but offline private, conversations that aren't recorded, spaces that aren't documented, moments that exist only in memory, not in searchable archives. You need places where you can be unfiltered, where you can say things you're not sure about, where you can express feelings that aren't fully formed, where you can be wrong, messy, contradictory, human. And those places have to be with people who won't weaponize your authenticity, who won't screenshot your vulnerability, who won't use your honesty against you later. Finding those people is hard. Most people are as trapped in performance as you are. Most people can't offer genuine safety because they're not sure they're genuinely safe themselves. But some people can. Some people have managed to maintain the capacity for authentic relating, who value honesty over performance, who understand that growth requires making mistakes, who create space for you to be real without punishing you for it. Find those people, invest in those relationships, protect those spaces, because they're where your authentic self can practice existing again, where it can remember what it feels like to be unguarded, where it can rebuild the capacity for genuine expression that constant performance has eroded. And even in those safe spaces, even with trusted people, authenticity will be uncomfortable at first. You've been performing for so long that being unfiltered feels wrong, dangerous, irresponsible. You'll want to hedge, to qualify, to add disclaimers, to protect yourself, even in spaces where protection isn't necessary. That impulse is your performance trying to maintain itself. Resist it. Let yourself be awkward. Let yourself say things badly. Let yourself be wrong. Let yourself be in process. And when the people you're with don't punish you for it, when they receive your messy authenticity with care rather than judgment, let that reprogram your sense of what's possible. Let it teach you that maybe, in some spaces, with some people, authenticity is safe enough to risk. You also need to radically reduce your public performance, not by being more authentic online, that's still too risky for most people in most contexts, but by being less online, by reducing your digital presence, by opting out of platforms that require constant performance, by stopping the endless cycle of posting, sharing, curating, managing your image for public consumption. Because every moment you spend performing online is a moment you're not spending being authentic offline. Every bit of energy that goes into managing your digital persona is energy that's not available for genuine relating in physical spaces. This will feel like disappearing, like losing connection, like missing out. Your online connections will fade, your visibility will decrease, opportunities that depend on digital presence will become less available. But what you gain is time, energy, mental space, the capacity to invest in real relationships instead of performed ones, the freedom to exist without constant documentation, the possibility of having experiences that aren't content, moments that are just moments, not material for your online narrative. And in that space, in that freedom from performance, authenticity becomes accessible again. Not all at once, not easily, but gradually. As you spend less time managing how you're perceived and more time actually being, you start to remember what being feels like. You start to reconnect with thoughts and feelings that don't need to pass through palatability filters. You start to rediscover aspects of yourself that have been suppressed because they didn't fit your performed persona. And you start to realize how much of yourself you'd lost in service of being acceptable. You also need to make peace with being misunderstood. This is hard, maybe impossible. We all want to be seen accurately, want our intentions to be recognized, want our complexity to be acknowledged. But online, misunderstanding is inevitable. Context will be lost, nuance will be flattened, things you said in good faith will be interpreted in bad faith, statements you meant one way will be taken another way, and you can't control that, can't prevent it, can't manage your way out of it. The only thing you can do is accept that misunderstanding will happen and decide it's still worth being authentic anyway. This doesn't mean being careless, doesn't mean saying harmful things and hiding behind, "that's not what I meant." It means accepting that even when you're careful, even when you're thoughtful, even when you try to communicate clearly, some people will misunderstand you. Some people will interpret you in the worst possible light. Some people will use your words as weapons. And that's a cost of being yourself in public spaces, a cost you have to decide whether you're willing to pay. For many people, the answer will be no. The cost is too high, the risk too great, and that's valid. You don't owe anyone your authentic self in contexts that aren't safe. You don't have to be vulnerable in spaces that will weaponize your vulnerability. It's okay to perform in public and save authenticity in private. It's okay to curate your image online and be real only offline. It's okay to protect yourself by maintaining a managed persona in contexts where authenticity carries too much risk. But you can't do that everywhere with everyone all the time without losing yourself. You need at least some spaces where you can be real, some relationships where you can be unguarded, some moments where you're not performing. And those spaces, those relationships, those moments, they're what keep your authentic self alive. What reminds you that beneath the performance, there's still someone real, someone who has thoughts that don't fit approved narratives, feelings that aren't socially acceptable, opinions that are still forming, contradictions that haven't been resolved, someone messy and incomplete and in process, someone human. And that human self, that authentic self, deserves to exist, deserves space to be, deserves relationships where it's safe to be seen, deserves to not spend its entire existence performing for safety. The environment has made authenticity risky, made performance necessary for survival, made constant vigilance the price of navigating modern life. But those conditions, hostile as they are, don't have to be permanent, don't have to define every space you inhabit, don't have to colonize every relationship you maintain. You can create different conditions, can build relationships based on genuine safety rather than performed acceptability, can invest in contexts where authenticity is valued more than performance, can protect spaces where being yourself isn't a liability but a gift. Those spaces won't be public, won't be digital, won't be visible or validated by the structures that reward performance, but they'll be real. And in a world of constant performance, in an environment designed to punish authenticity, real is what matters most. Being yourself feels risky now because it is risky. The environment has changed in ways that make authenticity genuinely dangerous. Digital permanence means nothing fades. Context collapse means everything is public. Call-out culture means mistakes are unforgivable. Algorithmic amplification means misunderstandings spread faster than corrections. These aren't imagined threats. They're real structural changes that make being yourself riskier than it's ever been in human history. But risk doesn't mean impossibility, it means choice. A choice about where you invest your authenticity, who you trust with it, what contexts feel safe enough to risk it. And while the broader environment may remain hostile, while public spaces may continue punishing authenticity, while digital platforms may keep rewarding performance, you can still choose to create and protect spaces where being yourself is safe, where the risk is worth it, where the alternative, constant performance, perpetual hiding, complete suppression of your authentic self, is a greater cost than the risk of being seen. But before we get to how to rebuild spaces for authenticity, we need to understand something deeper about what's happening biologically when you perform instead of being yourself. Because this isn't just psychological discomfort, this is your social nervous system responding to genuine threats in your environment. And understanding that response, understanding why your body treats authenticity as dangerous, is essential to understanding why this feels so impossible and what it actually takes to change it. Your nervous system has evolved over millions of years to detect social threat, to know when being yourself will get you rejected, ostracized, excluded from the group. And in our evolutionary past, exclusion was a death sentence. Humans survived as social animals. Being cast out meant not surviving. So your nervous system became exquisitely sensitive to social threat, to signs that you might be rejected, to cues that you need to modify your behavior to maintain acceptance. This is called social neuroception, the unconscious detection of safety or threat in social contexts. When your social nervous system detects safety, when it perceives that you're with people who accept you, who won't reject you for being yourself, it allows authentic expression. Your face becomes more expressive, your voice has more range, your gestures become natural, you can think more clearly, you can be creative, you can be vulnerable. This is your social engagement system. It's what allows connection, intimacy, genuine relating. It only functions when you feel socially safe. But when your social nervous system detects threat, when it perceives that being yourself might lead to rejection, it shifts into defensive mode. Your face becomes a mask, your voice flattens, your gestures become controlled, your thinking becomes rigid. You can't access creativity or vulnerability. You perform what's safe instead of expressing what's real. This is your defensive social system. It's what keeps you accepted when authentic self would be rejected. It's performance, and it activates automatically, below conscious awareness, whenever your nervous system detects social threat. And here's the problem. Modern life sends constant social threat signals, not occasionally, constantly. Every time you post something online, your nervous system knows it will be evaluated by hundreds or thousands of people. That's threat. Every time you speak in a professional context, your nervous system knows it could affect your livelihood. That's threat. Every time you share an opinion, your nervous system knows it could be screenshotted, shared, misinterpreted, used against you. That's threat. These aren't imagined threats, they're real. Your environment genuinely contains social risks that didn't exist in the past, and your nervous system is responding accurately to those risks by activating defensive performance. This matters because you can't think your way out of a nervous system response. You can't convince yourself that it's safe to be authentic when your biology is correctly detecting that it's not. You can tell yourself, I should be more real, more honest, more vulnerable, but if your nervous system is detecting social threat, it won't allow authentic expression. It will keep you in performance mode because performance mode is what keeps you safe when the environment is hostile. And the environment is hostile. So your nervous system is doing exactly what it should be doing, protecting you from social rejection through careful management of how you present yourself. But here's what makes this unbearable. Your nervous system isn't designed to stay in defensive performance mode constantly. It's designed to alternate, to perform when necessary, and relax into authenticity when safe. The problem is that modern life never signals safety. There's no clear, you can stop performing now moment. No definitive, this space is safe for authenticity cue. You're always potentially being evaluated, always potentially being recorded, always at risk of social consequences for being yourself. So your nervous system never gets the signal that it's safe to drop the performance. It just stays activated in defensive mode, performing constantly because the threats are constant. And constant performance in defensive mode is exhausting and psychologically damaging in ways that aren't immediately obvious. When you're in defensive social mode, you're cut off from parts of yourself, from genuine feeling, from creative thinking, from authentic desire, from the full range of human experience. You're operating in a narrow bandwidth optimized for safety, not for living. And living in that narrow bandwidth long term creates a kind of psychic numbness. You can function, you can meet obligations, you can maintain relationships on the surface, but you can't feel fully alive, can't access the vitality that comes from genuine self-expression, can't experience the deep connection that comes from being truly seen. This is what creates the peculiar loneliness of modern performative existence. You can be surrounded by people, have active social media, busy social calendar, constant digital connection, and still feel profoundly alone. Because none of those connections touch the real you. They touch the performed version, the managed persona, the carefully curated presentation. And you know it. You know that what people see isn't what's actually there. You know that their acceptance is conditional on you maintaining the performance. That if they saw what you're hiding, if they knew what you're suppressing, if they encountered the parts of yourself that don't fit the persona, they might reject you. So you can't relax, can't trust the connection, can't believe the acceptance is real because the acceptance is for someone who isn't fully you. And this creates a vicious cycle. The more you perform, the more isolated you become. The more isolated you become, the more you need connection. The more you need connection, the more you're willing to perform to get it. And around and around. Each cycle making the performance more automatic, the authentic self more suppressed, the isolation more profound, until you've lost track of where the performance ends and you begin, until you're not sure there's anything underneath the performance anymore, until your authentic self has been suppressed so thoroughly for so long that you can't access it even when you try. Breaking this cycle requires creating conditions that send different signals to your nervous system, conditions that genuinely reduce social threat, that actually create safety for authentic expression. And those conditions can't be faked or forced or thought into existence. They have to be real. Your nervous system isn't dumb. It can detect genuine safety versus performed safety. It knows the difference between someone who says, "You can be yourself with me," while still judging and evaluating, and someone who actually creates space for messy, imperfect, authentic humanity. So, what creates genuine safety? Physical presence, face-to-face interaction where you can read facial expressions, hear vocal tones, see body language. Digital communication strips most of this away, which is part of why it triggers defensive performance. Your nervous system doesn't trust what it can't fully perceive. Consistency over time, repeated experiences of being authentic without being rejected. One safe interaction isn't enough. Your nervous system needs pattern, needs to learn through repetition that this person, this space, is reliably safe. Shared vulnerability. When someone else is authentic with you, when they show their own messiness and imperfection, it signals that authentic expression is valued here, that performance isn't required, that you can let your guard down. And perhaps most importantly, repair. The ability to have conflict, misunderstanding, rupture, and repair it. Because perfect safety doesn't exist. Even in the best relationships, there will be moments of hurt, misunderstanding, disconnection. What matters is whether those moments destroy the relationship or strengthen it through repair. When you can be authentic, have that authenticity cause problems, and then work through those problems together, that's when your nervous system learns that authenticity is sustainable, that it doesn't lead to permanent rejection, that mistakes can be forgiven, that growth is possible, that the relationship can handle the full, messy reality of who you are. But modern life systematically prevents all of these conditions. Digital communication dominates. Consistency is rare because relationships are unstable and transactional. Shared vulnerability is risky because it can be weaponized. And repair is nearly impossible because mistakes are treated as unforgivable, cancelable offenses rather than opportunities for growth. So your nervous system keeps getting the message that authenticity is dangerous, that performance is necessary, that letting your guard down will lead to rejection, and it responds accordingly by keeping you locked in defensive performance mode. This is why individual technique-based solutions, mindfulness, self-compassion, just be yourself advice, don't work. They're trying to override your nervous system's accurate assessment of threat. They're asking you to be authentic in conditions that are genuinely unsafe for authenticity. And while you might be able to do that briefly through willpower or spiritual practice or sheer determination, you can't sustain it because your nervous system will keep pulling you back into defensive mode as long as the environmental threats remain real. So the work isn't just psychological, it's environmental. It's finding or creating spaces where the conditions for authentic expression genuinely exist, where you have face-to-face presence, where you have consistency over time, where vulnerability is mutual, where repair is possible. And those spaces are rare, increasingly rare, because modern life is structured against all of those conditions. But they're not impossible. They exist in small pockets, in certain friendships, in specific communities, in relationships that have been deliberately cultivated to support authenticity rather than performance. And finding those spaces, investing in those relationships, protecting those conditions, that's not optional. That's survival. Because you can't live your entire life in defensive performance mode without breaking, without losing touch with who you actually are, without becoming so disassociated from your authentic self that you can't access it anymore. The cost of constant performance isn't just exhaustion, it's loss of self. It's becoming so disconnected from your genuine thoughts, feelings, desires that you don't know what's real anymore. Everything becomes performance. Even your interior life has been colonized by performance. And when that happens, when even your interior life has been colonized by performance, there's nothing left, just the performed version. And the performed version is hollow. So creating space for authenticity isn't self-indulgence, it's not optional, It's existential necessity. It's the work of staying human in an environment designed to turn you into a performing machine, into a carefully managed brand, into a persona optimized for social acceptance at the cost of genuine being. And that work looks different for different people in different circumstances, but it always includes the same core elements: finding people who can be safe, creating contexts where performance isn't required, protecting time and space for genuine expression, accepting that this will be disappointing some people, losing some connections, seeming less perfect to those who only know your performed version. It also means accepting that you'll never be fully authentic everywhere with everyone, that some degree of performance is necessary for navigating certain contexts, that you don't owe your authentic self to spaces and people that aren't safe for it. This isn't defeat. This isn't giving up. This is realistic assessment of what's possible in an environment that's genuinely hostile to authenticity. You can't be fully yourself at work if being fully yourself means risking your livelihood. You can't be fully yourself online if being fully yourself means risking public humiliation. You can't be fully yourself in casual relationships if being fully yourself means risking rejection from people who don't know you well enough to handle your complexity. So you make choices, strategic choices about where to invest your authenticity. And those choices will often mean performing in public spaces, in professional contexts, in digital platforms, in casual relationships. That's fine. That's adaptive. That's appropriate response to real risk. The problem only comes when there's nowhere you can be authentic, when every space requires performance, when every relationship is managed, when there's no context safe enough for genuine expression. That's when the cost becomes unbearable. That's when you start losing yourself. So creating space for authenticity is safer than performance, where the cost of hiding is higher than the risk of being seen, where genuine expression is valued more than careful management. And those spaces are rare, private, probably offline, definitely not documented or performed for public consumption. They'll exist in the gaps of modern life, in friendships that prioritize depth over breadth, in relationships that value honesty over harmony, in moments that aren't content, in conversations that aren't recorded, in experiences that exist only in memory. And in those spaces, you practice being yourself again. Not perfectly, not without fear, not without the lingering habit of performance trying to reassert itself, but genuinely, messily, imperfectly. You say things you're not sure about. You express feelings that don't make complete sense. You show parts of yourself that aren't polished or acceptable or safe. And when the people you're with don't reject you for it, when they receive your messy authenticity with care instead of judgment, something begins to heal. The part of you that's been in constant defensive performance starts to believe that maybe, just maybe, authenticity is possible after all, in some spaces, with some people, sometimes. And that sometimes is enough. You don't need to be authentic everywhere to be okay. You just need to be authentic somewhere, with someone. Enough that your authentic self doesn't completely atrophy. Enough that you remember what it feels like to be seen rather than to perform being seen. Enough that you maintain connection to who you actually are underneath all the managed presentations and careful performances and strategic self-revelations. This also requires grieving what's been lost, the simplicity of authenticity, the ease of being yourself without calculation, the freedom to speak without wondering how it will be received, the ability to be messy and imperfect without permanent consequences, the experience of being truly known by many people rather than truly known by almost no one. These things are gone, for most people, in most contexts, and grieving that loss is part of the work because you can't move forward while pretending things haven't changed, while acting like authenticity is still as simple as it used to be. It's not. It won't be again. The environmental conditions that supported it have been fundamentally altered, And accepting that reality, grieving what's been lost, is necessary before you can build something new. What's new won't be the same as what was, won't be the easy, unguarded authenticity that was possible when nothing was recorded and mistakes faded from memory and growth was expected. It will be something more strategic, more protected, more contained to specific context with specific people. It will require more work, more vigilance about who you trust and where you're vulnerable and what you share where. It will mean living with more performance than you'd like, more hiding than feels comfortable, more calculation than seems healthy. But it will also mean having some spaces, some relationships, some moments where you don't have to perform, where you can be real, where you can be seen. And in a world of constant performance, those spaces become sacred. Those relationships become essential. Those moments become what keep you tethered to who you actually are, beneath all the versions of yourself you perform for safety. Being yourself feels risky now because the world has changed in ways that make it genuinely risky. The structures that used to support authenticity, private space, forgettable mistakes, context-specific selves, relationships outside public view, have collapsed. And in their place, we have digital permanence, context collapse, viral misinterpretation, and professional consequences for personal expression. These aren't temporary problems. They're fundamental shifts in how human social life is structured, and they're not going away. So the question isn't how to make being yourself feel safe again. It won't. Not universally, not everywhere. The question is how to create enough pockets of genuine safety that you can be yourself sometimes, somewhere, with someone. How to protect those pockets fiercely from the forces that would turn them into more spaces for performance. How to invest your authentic self strategically in contexts that can actually hold it, rather than spreading it everywhere and having it rejected everywhere. How to live in an environment hostile to authenticity while maintaining connection to your authentic self. How to perform when necessary while remembering that performing isn't the same as being. How to survive in a world of masks while keeping your face underneath intact. That's the work. Not simple, not easy, not the same as it used to be, but possible and necessary, because the alternative, full-time performance, complete suppression of authentic self, total loss of connection to who you actually are, that's not sustainable. That's slow psychological death. That's becoming a hollow persona animated by other people's expectations rather than genuine being. And you can function that way. Many people do. But you can't thrive, can't feel fully alive, can't experience the kind of deep connection and genuine satisfaction that only comes from being truly seen and accepted for who you actually are. So you do the work. You find the people, you create the spaces, you protect the conditions, you grieve what's lost, you accept what's possible. You choose where to be authentic and where to perform. You live with more performance than you'd like, but less than the culture demands. You maintain connection to yourself even when you can't show yourself. You remember who you are even when you're being who you need to be. You keep your authentic self alive as you navigate an environment designed to kill it. But let's be specific about what this work actually looks like in practice, because the abstraction, find safe people, create safe spaces, can feel overwhelming when you're starting from a place of total performance. Where do you even begin when every relationship you have is built on performed versions of yourself? When every space you occupy requires careful management? When you can't remember the last time you were genuinely unguarded with anyone? You begin small, impossibly small, with one person if you can find them, with one conversation where you let one small truth slip through that you normally hide, with one moment of not hedging, not qualifying, not performing the safety you usually perform. It won't feel revolutionary, won't feel enough, but it's a beginning. It's your authentic self, atrophied from years of suppression, testing whether it's still possible to exist, whether there's anyone out there who can receive it, whether the risk of being seen is survivable. And you'll probably fail first, probably choose wrong about who feels safe, probably reveal something to someone who doesn't handle it well, probably get hurt, get misunderstood, get rejected. This is part of the process, part of recalibrating your sense of who's actually safe versus who just seems safe. Part of learning that rejection, while painful, doesn't destroy you, that being misunderstood, while disappointing, doesn't erase you, that you can be authentic, have it go badly, and survive. And that survival, that evidence that bad reception isn't death, is what gives you courage to try again. Because the fear of being yourself isn't just fear of rejection. It's fear that rejection will be annihilating, that being seen and rejected will confirm that your authentic self is unacceptable, that the performance was necessary because the real you is unbearable. But when you survive rejection, when you're authentic with someone and they reject it, but you're still okay, you learn that rejection isn't annihilation, isn't confirmation that you're unacceptable. It's just information that this person, in this moment, couldn't receive this part of you. And that's about them, about the relationship, about the context, not about whether you're fundamentally okay. Learning this requires repetition, requires being authentic enough times that you accumulate evidence that some people can receive you, that some spaces are safe, that some moments of authenticity go well, that being yourself, while risky, isn't always punished, isn't always met with rejection. Sometimes gets met with acceptance, with recognition, with someone saying, "Me too," or "I understand," or "Thank you for sharing that." And those moments, those glimpses of being seen and accepted, are what make continued risk possible. You also need to practice discernment. Not everyone who seems safe is actually safe. Not everyone who says they value authenticity can actually handle it. Not everyone who invites vulnerability is prepared to hold it with care. Learning to distinguish genuine safety from performed safety is essential. And that learning comes through testing, through small revelations that increase in vulnerability as trust is earned, through watching how people handle small truths before entrusting them with larger ones, through noticing whether their actions match their words, whether they practice what they preach, whether they're as authentic with you as they ask you to be with them. Red flags appear in specific patterns. People who demand vulnerability but never offer it themselves. People who use your honesty as ammunition in later conflicts. People who share your private disclosures with others. People who judge you for exactly the things you invited you to share. People who say they want realness but punish you when you're real in ways they don't like. Learning to recognize these patterns, learning to trust your gut when something feels off, even if you can't articulate why, is part of building authentic safety. And sometimes people who were safe become unsafe. Relationships change. People's capacity changes. What was once a space for authenticity becomes a space of judgment or comparison or weaponized vulnerability. This is painful, is a betrayal of what was, but it's also information that this relationship isn't safe anymore, that you need to pull back, that what you share here needs to be more managed. This isn't failure. This is appropriate boundary adjustments based on changing circumstances. And learning to adjust boundaries when safety changes, learning to protect yourself without closing off completely, is part of sustainable authenticity. You also need to accept that authentic expression will sometimes mean conflict, mean disappointing people, mean saying no when yes would be easier, mean expressing disagreement when agreement would maintain harmony, mean showing emotions that aren't convenient for others, means taking up space that others might wish you didn't occupy. Authentic self isn't always pleasant or convenient or easy for others to be around. Sometimes your authentic needs conflict with others' authentic needs. Sometimes your authentic truth triggers others' defenses. Sometimes being yourself creates friction. And that friction, that conflict, that disappointing of others, it's been so thoroughly trained out of you through years of performance that it will feel almost unbearable at first. Will feel like failure, like you're doing something wrong, like you should apologize and fix it and get back to being the easy, accommodating, non-friction creating version of yourself that everyone prefers. But resisting that impulse, allowing the friction to exist, allowing others to be disappointed, allowing conflict to surface rather than performing it away, that's essential to authentic existence. Because authentic existence creates friction. If you're not creating any friction, you're probably still performing. This requires developing tolerance for others' discomfort, for their disappointment, for their displeasure with your authentic choices. You've been trained to manage others' comfort, to make yourself smaller or different or easier when your authentic self creates discomfort for them. Breaking that training means letting them be uncomfortable, letting them work through their own responses to your authenticity, trusting that their discomfort is theirs to manage, not yours to prevent. This feels selfish, feels wrong, feels like violation of unspoken social contracts about managing each other's comfort, but those contracts are exactly what prevent authentic existence, and breaking them is necessary. You also need practices that keep you connected to your authentic self, even when you're performing in other contexts. Journaling, actual private journaling, not digital platforms that might be hacked or leaked, where you can express unfiltered thoughts, where you can work through feelings without translating them for acceptability, where you can be as messy and contradictory and uncertain as you actually are without anyone else's response shaping what you write. This is essential, is practice for authentic expression, is reminder that your authentic thoughts still exist even when you're not sharing them publicly. Creative practices help too, making art that's truly private, that you don't share, that doesn't have to be good or impressive or meaningful to anyone but you, that's just expression for the sake of expression. Authenticity doesn't always need audience. Sometimes it just needs outlet, needs way to exist outside your head, needs form that confirms it's real even if no one else sees it. Private creative practice is that outlet, is proof to yourself that your authentic self still exists even when it's mostly hidden. Physical practices matter also. Your body holds what can't be expressed verbally. Movement, dance, walking, any form that's not about fitness or productivity, but just about embodied existence, helps keep you connected to authentic physical self, to sensations and impulses that haven't been performed or managed or shaped for others' comfort, to the raw experience of being in a body before that experience gets translated into acceptable presentation. Regular movement practice that's truly private, truly for you, helps maintain that connection. And you need reminders, written reminders, notes to yourself about who you actually are underneath the performance, what you actually value, what you actually want, what you actually think and feel and believe when no one's watching. Because performance is so automatic, so unconscious, that you can forget you're doing it, can forget there's anything underneath it. Written reminders to yourself, private, kept for only you, help interrupt that forgetting, help keep you tethered to the truth of yourself, even when you're showing something different to the world. All of this, the small tests of safety, the practice with rejection, the tolerance for others' discomfort, the private practices that maintain connection to authentic self, all of this is preparation, is building capacity for authentic existence in a hostile environment, is creating internal infrastructure that can support being yourself even when external conditions make it risky. Because you can't wait for perfect external conditions before being authentic. Perfect conditions don't exist, will never exist. You have to build the capacity to be authentic in imperfect conditions. And that capacity comes from practice, from repeatedly choosing authenticity in small doses in less risky contexts until the muscle is strong enough to handle higher risk authentic expression. And through all of this, through all the work of finding safe people and creating safe spaces and practicing authentic expression, you need to remember that this isn't about becoming perfectly authentic everywhere with everyone. That's not the goal, not realistic, not even desirable. Some contexts will always require performance. Some relationships will always be managed. Some spaces will never be safe for your full authentic self. And that's okay. That's appropriate response to real environmental conditions. The goal isn't to eliminate all performance. The goal is to reduce performance to sustainable levels, to have enough pockets of authentic existence that your authentic self doesn't completely atrophy, to maintain connection to who you actually are, even while performing who you need to be in contexts that require it. This is sustainable authenticity in hostile conditions. Not the ideal, not what used to be possible, not what should be possible, but what is possible given current environmental reality. And while it's less than what authenticity used to mean, while it requires more work and more protection and more strategic choice than it should, it's also enough. Enough to maintain your humanity, enough to prevent complete dissolution into performed persona, enough to keep you tethered to who you actually are beneath all the versions of yourself you show for safety. That's how you stay yourself in a world that makes being yourself feel impossible. Not by being yourself everywhere, that's too risky, but by being yourself somewhere, with someone. Sometimes, enough to remember, enough to stay connected, enough to survive intact in a world that wants you hollow.